When it comes to the key admin centers of Microsoft 365, clearly SharePoint Online is one of those workloads that has been around for a long time. It was one of the earliest workloads as part of Office 365, and it's still a key workload for organizations that need an online storage solution for documents that are easily accessible through web portals. So in order to access the SharePoint Admin Center, I'm going to go down to my list of admin centers and click on SharePoint. Once I'm in the SharePoint Admin Centers, I have some interesting cards that are added by default. For example, my SharePoint file activity is a good one where I actually see the number of files that have been accessed, edited, synced, and so on. Now, as soon as I mention syncing, I must highlight the fact that the terminology sometimes gets a little bit confusing. A lot of people get confused between SharePoint and OneDrive, and Microsoft uses the terminology sometimes interchangeably. There's also Microsoft OneDrive. There's OneDrive for Business and OneDrive Client. It can really get confusing. Truth is that a lot of the components that are branded as OneDrive has SharePoint in the background, and that's usually a good way of thinking about it as well. The client application that we use to sync down SharePoint files on computers is called the OneDrive client. So when you are working from a Windows client and you need to download the files locally, you can either go into the web portal, view the files from there, or use the OneDrive client to download your SharePoint sites locally so that you can have a local COI on your computer work offline when you're traveling and disconnected from the network. So what we have in SharePoint is we have SharePoint sites, so I can see my sites here. If I click on Active Sites, I see all of my SharePoint sites. I can create a new site as well. Think of a site as really a collaborative space for documents to be stored in my organization. I use a lot of SharePoint sites to share files with both internal users and external users. Allow external users to either view my sites or modify the content in the SharePoint sites. So this here is the location where you would create a site and then assign permissions to that site. If I click on Policies and then Sharing, this is where I see who can access the SharePoint sites. And this is very important if you are sharing with external users. So first of all, here you see what the permissions are. Now there's permissions in OneDrive and SharePoint, and it actually shows you how those permissions work together. As well, if I click here on More External Sharing Settings, this is where the true configuration is for allowing external sharing to sites. Now one that's usually a good recommendation to use is that guests must sign in using the same account to which the sharing invitation is sent. So if you're sending an invitation to someone that has a Gmail account, for example, and they want to use a Facebook account to sign in, they won't have access because the invitation is tied to the account that is receiving the SharePoint invitation and therefore the one that is going to access the SharePoint site. So we have different options here and all of those relate to external sharing. I like to turn on this one as well, which is allowing guests to share items that they don't own. I like to turn that one off, so that one is sometimes turned on. I like to turn it off. It's not a good idea in terms of security to have that one turned on. Next up here I have some default options as well as the default option for viewing or editing the SharePoint site or the content in the SharePoint site. So the default setting is View. If you're just clicking Next in Sharing, that will be the default option. Any changes here, we click Save, the changes are saved, and now our sharing policy is set for both SharePoint and OneDrive. Next I can go here under Settings where I have all of my various sites and the default settings for those sites as well. I have my migration interface over here. This is where you can migrate your data from different sources, whether it's an on-premise SharePoint server or if it's a third-party product like Box and Dropbox and Google Workspaces and so on. Those are all available as tools that you can pull your files from and move them through Microsoft 365. Next, I have here some reports that I can generate as well for my SharePoint sites. So SharePoint Admin Center is a relatively mature tool in configuring your files for your Microsoft 365 tenant. I urge you to become familiar with this tool. If you are utilizing OneDrive or SharePoint, likely you're going to need to use the SharePoint Admin Center to implement various settings.